ask them regardless. Ann and I are, of course, very delighted to be here. We've enjoyed the week here at NACM, and she and I usually only have a chance to see each other at international conferences. So we were happy to be able to put this presentation together for NACM because it also allowed us to have another opportunity to see each other here in Texas. I'm going to, let me just go through this briefly with you. Ann and I both engaged in research on all of you and on the profession of judicial administration. My research is out of the federal and state courts in the US, and Ann's research is out of the court system in Australia. What we would like to do today, and what we plan to do, unless you change our minds, is that I will review my research findings. Ann's going to review her research findings. And I would ask you to jot down notes or questions that you have, though we are more than happy to entertain those throughout the presentation, because we'd like to engage in a discussion about what you think these findings mean for individual administrators as they're pursuing their careers, for associations who are always, their primary purpose is the continuing education and training of their members. And associations, of course, in this vein are organized around a profession. And then what if you are managers or in some situation within a court, what would you do related to mentoring or development of classifications and hiring and onboarding related to the findings that we're going to discuss with you? So that's how we're going to proceed over the next 75 minutes, unless you tell us that that was really a bad idea. And if it's really bad idea, stop us somewhere in the mix related to this. Okay, questions or comments before I get started? You just don't want to talk into that microphone, right? Okay, so about 2 years ago, I undertook, now they told me this would work. Yay, it worked. I undertook a survey related to what kind of credentials do the current leaders of the courts believe that the future leaders ought to have in order to move into the top positions within the courts. And you might wonder, with everything else going on, why did I take on that particular topic? Well, quite frankly, we did it for a number of reasons, but I can tell you, as a person who has been involved in education training in courts for a few decades now, the question that I always get asked is, does it matter? And if it matters, what are the combinations of courses and skills should I work to obtain in order to make myself desirable in the marketplace for a career in this profession? So I said, I think that that is a discoverable answer. And then there were some other factors that played into us doing this survey at this time. But to answer that question, I put together a research advisory committee comprised of all of our partner providers and all of the states and courts who wanted to help guide the research. And we looked at what kind of education is desirable. Is there a mix of experience that would be viewed as desirable for these upcoming positions? And if we're talking about the top two positions, what kind of leadership characteristics and abilities would be desirable? And is there a set of knowledge and skills and competencies related to those knowledge and skills that could give you the leg up, if you will, make you the most competitive candidate in that job pool. So we investigated the 4 areas that you see on the slide here. And in addition to the reasons that I already told you why we engaged in this research at this time, we looked at what was taking place and said this could perhaps, in this profession, be the age of the perfect storm. Now, perfect storm is probably a little bit overused these days, just like I'm kind of sick of hearing tipping point, even though I use it myself. But it is in some ways a perfect storm. Because at this point in our profession, that really began to take noticeable shape, if you will, with LEAA money in the 1970s, which many of you I think are too young to have taken advantage of. I took advantage of it. That's when we really started to consolidate our profession in a way in which it was noticeable. So all the people who prepared during that time, myself being one of them, the baby boomers, are on their way out. Some of you are going, yay! Gosh, we've been waiting for them to leave. Others are saying, wow, what's going to happen when all that knowledge walks out the door? What happens when they walk out the door? Now, many of us would have already left had it not been for the budget crisis that took place. So what we knew was that there are massive numbers of baby boomer retirements that are coming up. It's happening simultaneously with the fact that we had the biggest financial collapse since the Great Depression, which has altered how budgets are constructed, and many analysts say it will forever change the way in which we do our funding. We'll have to wait and see. I will be on the beach with the umbrella in the drink when you all will still be dealing with that. And then what we also happen simultaneously is that technology changes the way we work. And consequently, it changes the kind of skill set that top level leaders and managers are looking for in the next generation of workers. And lastly, we wanted to see, is there a changing mix of desirable credentials? Is it different now than it was before? And is it projected to be different in the future? And if all of these things are in play, what does that mean for you to prepare for a career in the courts? And so what we attempted to do, the research committee of Michigan State attempted to do with this research, was to provide you with enough information to help you guide your professional development, your preparation, so that you can look at where you are and where you want to be and what might be the most desirable paths for you to take to get there. So this is what we found. And mind you, this is all going to be published. Believe it or not, we are still doing the multivariate analysis. We are into 500 pages. We know you won't read all 500 pages, so we'll be doing an executive summary, but there is a wealth of information here that you could break it down to your own needs and use this for your career planning. Because Ann and I are all about our students. And whether you're currently our students or not, you're here in this room, so we're thinking you're our students. So here's what we found. This is our survey respondent group. Now, we had over 900 people who accessed this survey. 408 completed all survey sections. People bounced around within the survey. But here's what we found out, that the bulk of the respondents were from the federal courts. The primary position type for the responses were in the top 2 positions of the court. The length of service, believe it or not, 61% of the respondents had upwards of 30 years of experience. 63% of the people who responded were women. 50% of the people responded were over the age of 50. 73% of the respondents had a minimum of a bachelor's degree, and 90% of the respondents were white or Caucasians. Now, I'm guessing if you look at those statistics of what the respondent group looked like, you will say, as you look around, probably at your state conferences and here, that is reflective of what you see in this employment group. That also tells you you have an aging population, and you didn't need this survey to tell you that, but it in fact verifies that this is going to be a wide open field. It's going to be wide open. So the demographics are only important in this way. It gives you a sense for who responded to the survey. And when we did the statistical analysis to ensure that we had statistically sound data, the metrics that we ran on the data said that it was sound, regardless of the variables. Say, okay, desired education for the future. Regardless of whether you're in a clerk administrator position or want to go for a clerk administrator position, or whether you're in line to think about a deputy position, your long-range goal ought to be a minimum of a bachelor's degree. And the terminal degree was considered to be a master's degree in administration, preferably judicial administration, for the courts, if you want to move into those top two positions. Now, today, I did not find that surprising. I would have found that surprising 20 years ago. I would have even found that even more surprising 30 years ago, because the courts have traditionally been an employer where you could go from high school or a 2-year degree into the courts and move up to some of the top level positions. What the current leaders say, that won't work anymore. So if you are in a place where you're making a decision about what kind of degree should I get a degree and what kind, if your long-term career aspiration is to stay in this field and move into progressively more responsible positions that provide you with more income, more visibility, more ability to make policy, you must prepare yourself educationally. And if you notice, there is not a difference, there's no statistical difference between the second in command position and the top position. The other piece of information here is just below this, as desired, was a law degree. So if you are looking for a job in a large court, perhaps in the federal system or in a larger metropolitan area, know that your competition will likely be law degrees and master's degrees in administration. That will likely be the most competitive degree combination. Then we asked the question, and when we asked the question about education, by the way, we did everything from high school all the way up to PhDs. Then we said, regardless of what kind of educational experience, because we draw in the courts from so many different professions, because it takes a variety of educational backgrounds and skill levels in order to operate our contemporary courts. Should the people who are looking for these top positions, regardless of their other educational experience, also look for a specialized course of study related to the courts, so we know what the knowledge base is and apply that knowledge base in a successful way in the courts? Here's what they said. That regardless of what your background is, if you haven't done any kind of specialized education related to our knowledge base in this profession, i.e. looking at NACM's core competencies, then if you're planning on moving up, this would put you ahead of the pack in line for jobs to be competitive. This was an interesting, I think up to this point, none of those findings surprised me. Did it surprise any of you? Make sense in this day and age? This was the other thing that I thought was interesting. We ask what kind of avenues of experience would perhaps make a candidate the most desirable candidate for the court administration, the top position. What would make them most desirable? This is what we found. This is what the folks who responded to the survey said. Two things that I think are interesting about this. One, many of our job descriptions say for the top position, you ought to have like 7 or 10 years of experience. The current court leaders, by and large, said you ought to have upwards of 5 years of experience. Look at the precipitous drop. Not 5 to 9 years, not 9 years or more. When I presented these findings last year at one of the federal court conferences, they said, I guess I better go back and look at my job descriptions. Because A, I don't know if we've got this appropriate for what this indicates, and whether we're looking for in our job descriptions the kind of past experience that might make one better prepared for the job. So that surprised me. The other thing that surprised me were look at the top 2 positions. Now, I found that to be fascinating because prior to this question, the answer was you need to have education that's related to administration. And then when we ask, what are the desirable experience avenues to get there, that's what came out on top. Do you have any idea why that was the case? And I am really asking that. Do you have any notion about why that would be the case? Let me get you the, okay.
I would guess that it's because that top layer is usually an appointed position, and it has, I hate to say, politics involved in it. And so there's some challenges in that, in placing those positions, whereas a lot of the other positions in the court system might be civil service.
Okay. So the top 2 positions could in fact either be appointed or elected, like if you're an elected clerk or some such thing as that?
Something that's appointed by the judges, whatever, however the court system is set up. Usually that position is an appointed position. And so there might be some political positioning that takes place in those jobs being appointed.
Okay, so the politics of the environment within which we work. Okay, thank you. Anything else? Over here? They tell us in order to get it on the webcam, you have to talk into that microphone.
I guess the question I would have, maybe answer that with question. How many of the respondents were lawyers as well? Because if they were lawyers, I mean, I'm a lawyer and I hate to say that, we attach, because there's 3 years of help, we attach a lot of importance to that degree. And it frankly is a bit of a club that, lawyers prefer lawyers. Gentlemen prefer blondes and lawyers prefer lawyers, I think, for those positions. Regardless of the qualities that someone may have, there's something attached to being able to persevere through 3 years of law school and get a license and pass an exam and all the rest. So if the respondents who answered the survey were predominantly lawyers, that doesn't surprise me at all.
They were predominantly not lawyers.
Well, then maybe there's even a greater aura attached to that law degree for people who work in a court system who aren't lawyers. There's as you know, in the court system, as compared to the legislative or even the executive branch, there's a tremendous amount of deference to a black robe. There's a tremendous amount of deference to the lawyers who practice. And so I suppose if those are longtime folks who have sort of drank the Kool-Aid over time and gave, an inordinate attachment to the black robe, the lawyers, and the like, you would attach, probably unnecessarily a great deal of importance to that law degree. And I will tell you, I'm a lawyer. I've been an administrator for 12 years. I certainly wouldn't have ranked it like that. My best managers I've had were certainly not the lawyers I had. And I've had lawyer managers and I've had non-lawyer managers. Mm-hmm. My non-lawyer managers have been far better managers. But, a lot of folks in the court system attach a lot of importance to that.
Exactly. That was my thought about it. But I'm going to try to either hold focus groups about the survey results and/or a Delphi study, because I think that my take, similar to yours, that the reason practicing attorneys and judges were selected is A, it's a political environment, and B, it is a legal environment. Though most people will tell you that the law degree is more akin to a union card and is not the skill set that you need to run a court. And it's more related to the acceptance of judges and lawyers than it is the necessity to practice that knowledge of a law degree within a court. It was fascinating. Because what we said is you really need to know the knowledge base of judicial management. But oh, by the way, probably if you were a practicing attorney or a judge, that would really, boost your credentials. And it probably would. But it's not likely that it would give you the skill set to be successful. So I'm going to be interested to do the follow-up on this. Anybody else have any reactions to this? Because I was hoping that wouldn't be the finding, but you know what, it was. What could I do? Now, the other thing that I thought was interesting with this, any other people looking at this going, wow, and there's a comment back here.
Just in my limited experience, I think sometimes when you're hiring folks and they have a law degree, and those are the ones that have law degrees but don't have the sort of the public administration degree or judicial administration degree. I think sometimes it actually hurts you when you have the law degree coming into and trying to manage a group of folks in the court, because I found that through law school they're trained to look at the exceptions and make cases about exceptions, whereas managers go to school and we do the opposite. We take a look and we plan for those exceptions. But by and large, we're looking at what's happening the lion's share of the time and managing around those principles. Mm-hmm. So I find this very interesting because, I've had managers who are hiring where if you have a law degree, they actually put you in the no or maybe pile automatically because of the experience they've had trying to retrain the lawyers to actually think differently than the way they were educated and think more like a manager. Mm-hmm. And that's not to say a criticism to anybody in the room who's got a law degree, but that's not to say that it can't happen, but that's a sort of interesting sort of thing, and just in my experience that I found.
Yeah, it's just a very interesting finding. I want you to look at this next slide too, because it was with the last two items.
I think following up on that, as managers, we are geared and trained to focusing on managing change. The truly successful managers are able to work with people and manage ambiguity within our systems. Judges and lawyers are more focused on precedent. What does the law say? How do you apply the law to this particular situation? So it's a very different approach, I think, that we're coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I still need to investigate this finding, by the way. And what I wouldn't do if I were you, being on the banana peel in the boomer generation, is I would not think, okay, I have no interest in being a judge, or I don't have the credentials to be a judge or a practicing attorney, so therefore does that mean I'm not a good candidate? And I don't think that that's the takeaway from this. I don't think that's the takeaway. I think that we have to understand that in our environment to date, we pay deference to those two positions. We pay deference to those two positions for a whole lot of reasons. Whether we ought to or not, it is the case for the group that is now in place. The question for you becomes, as you're planning your career, is as you become these spectacularly trained and prepared administrators with all of the knowledge and skill, will this be different? Because I want you to also think about the fact that the people who answered this survey did not have available to them the kind of educational opportunities that are now available. In the 60s, there were only, and early 70s, there were only a couple of programs that had a master's degree in judicial administration or law administration. The core competencies hadn't been consolidated in a way in which they were recognizable. We didn't talk about the fact that we had a knowledge base from which we could move forward with our credentials and gain in-depth study. That is now a change. So I think, and I have no data to compare this to because this is the first time a study like this has been done. So I can't go back and say, how have we traveled? I couldn't do a longitudinal study on it. I couldn't do a time study. So somebody going forward can come back and ask these questions, because I asked, what do you need over the next decade? And this is what we got. But here's the thing, the other thing that I thought was interesting, is if you're going into the top position, and oftentimes you believe being the chief deputy is a stepping stone, and I quite frankly still think it is, and at the federal level they'll tell you that the chief deputy position is in fact the position that gets you to the top more often than any other position. In this one it said, you know, yes, it's important, and that's a high statistic. It's still 71% thought that position was very important to get you to the next position. But what this also tells you is if you are in a lower position in the court or in a position that you don't particularly care for, that there are multiple avenues for you to proceed down to get the education and experience that would make you qualified for these positions. If you're doing career planning for yourself, or if you're looking at this to mentor your staff, or if you're thinking, what ought we be doing as our professional association to prepare our members for those career positions that they want? Make job announcements open, look at them, do analysis of those job announcements, and say, if you're mentoring somebody, you know, Sue or Fred or Shanika, you ought to look at this position. I don't want to lose you, but you ought to look at this position and apply for it. This could help build your career. Okay. Oops. For the chief deputy position, I think you will see relatively the same thing, that there are multiple avenues. These findings also say to me that there are many more ways in which you can find desirable past experiences to move into that chief deputy position, because they're all extremely high. And I thought it was interesting, why would the chief deputy be the highest one to move into a chief deputy position? Does that look odd to you? I know it looked odd to me too. Again, another area I want to do a focus group on, but this is what I believe it is because this is what I'm watching happening, is that chief deputies in smaller courts are applying for chief deputies in larger courts, because a chief deputy in a smaller court may not prepare them for the top level position in a larger court. So oftentimes in chief deputy positions, people will move based on size of court or geographic region. And you would say, why would you move from one chief deputy position to another? That's because we're not a hegemonic organization. We have a lot of diversity in our organizations, and given the various levels of courts and the geographic regions in which they are located, you can move with one title to another court and have that be a much more responsible position. Now, the third area that we looked at, or fourth area, I'm sorry, is what kind of leadership management characteristics ought you have? And I did investigation of the primary leadership traits and abilities, characteristics and abilities, that leaders who do research and practice, researchers who do research and practice in this area, about what are the characteristics and whether private or public sector jobs ought to be present if you're going to be in either the top two positions. And we categorized them in three ways. Ways of communicating and being, which is how are your communication skills, and who are you as a person? What is your attitude and your demeanor and your identity? Ways of thinking and perceiving is how do you intellectually and cognitively approach your work? And then last, ways of behaving and taking action. What kind of characteristics and traits do you use in the field of action? How do you proceed when you see something needs to be done? Interestingly enough, again, if you're going to go for those top two positions, the respondents said how you think and perceive is the most important. How you think and perceive. And for the chief deputy position, it's not statistically significant that ways of behaving and taking action is basically rated at the same level as ways of thinking and perceiving. Does this surprise you at all? Are you developing in your staff those people you've identified as either wanting to move forward or you just want them to engage cognitively with their work in a different way? What are we doing to increasing the way in which they think and perceive? Are you developing their cognitive skills? When you're mentoring them, are you taking them through a process where they learn how to think critically and creatively to look at all kinds of options? Are you doing that? I'm not going to go through all this, but I included it in the material so you would have it. If you're, again, looking to mentor or looking to develop your skills, these are the items that fell within ways of communicating and being. What are we doing about that? How are we encouraging that kind of development? Now, here's something that I thought was kind of interesting. This is all on a 5-point scale. 1 being least, 5 being most important. If you notice, none of them hit the 5-point range. Usually, when you're considering what's top importance, you look at 4.5 and above. And if you say, okay, moderately important, it's usually 3-point range and then not so important below that. I want you to think about why we don't think court administrators and chief deputy need to be friendly, outgoing, and social. What does this say about who we are? I looked at that and started laughing. No sense of humor? If you're going to take that position, you must have a sense of humor. And charismatic. I think we're not a dull and boring group, but this suggests maybe we should be. I was a little worried about this one. Of course, a joke, but really we do think about, we're always so serious all the time. We're serious. We do serious work. But I also think that we have to think about the fact that we can engage people more when we appear to be approachable. Now, the one difference in those that fell in the 3-point range was that I thought this was interesting, that the top position didn't need to be politically savvy so much, but that second position needed to be. I can't explain it. This is what the survey found. So again, how are we going about addressing the development of those aspects? And here's the ways of thinking and perceiving, which was viewed to be the top leadership capability. And you can see that in this, all of them were in the 4-point range. Are we doing that? Are we expecting our staff, or are we ourselves just saying, no, just do this and fill out the box and check this and do that, and you don't really have to look at it or, think about it. If we are, then we're missing the mark. If we're not really addressing this issue in the workplace, we're missing the mark. And ways of behaving and taking action. This is really about how do you approach situations that you know need to be addressed. Are you developing these skills? Are you developing these skills? I thought what was interesting about this was that if you look at these findings, what it says is that you really need to be a good thinker and move strategically. Action for the sake of action may not get you anywhere. So when you're preparing yourself and your skills, make sure that you're finding educational opportunities and work opportunities that develop these characteristics. This was an area that surprised me. We took the core competencies in addition to some additional areas that hadn't been broken out within the core competencies, and we said, and this is real content knowledge now, right? Because the leadership capabilities are attributes, they're abilities. This is your content area. This is about the work that you do to run the courts. And we said, okay, out of that mix of real content knowledge, what are the most important things for the chief administrator and the deputy to know? Only those 3 in red even showed up in the 4-point range for the chief administrator. None of them showed up in the 4-point range for the chief deputy. Do you have any ideas about why that might be the case? Because remember, we're talking about the top 2 positions and the desirable knowledge, skills, knowledge, education, experience, characteristics, and attributes for the leaders over the next decade. Over here.
Because you hire other people to do those jobs.
I thought that too.
Yeah, you're going to have an HR manager, you're going to have, somebody to handle communications and all the other stuff. You just make sure that they're the proper people in the proper places.
So you really need the leadership characteristics to know what your operation is about, be able to think about it and act strategically, think about it critically and act strategically, but you're not doing those jobs.
Correct.
Correct. That's kind of what I thought too. Anybody else? Okay, now this is what I want you to think about. What does the bulk of our education and training for court managers focus on? These areas. I'm just saying. We focus on almost all of our internal education and training, all of our national conferences, almost all of our state conferences, all of our mentoring, all of our on-the-job training, and there's some reason on-the-job training, because you're training those people who are doing the work so you don't have to, right? To do this. But what we said is, what these research findings tell us is if you're going to go to the top level positions, because remember, I did this for you to help develop your career path for the future. This is important, but if you don't develop the other leadership knowledge, skills, and abilities for those top level positions, you may be preparing yourself to stay in the same level of position you're in. Any other thoughts about that? Because in fact, what I also thought on this is that this is not surprising if you look at the ones in red, because they actually deal with leadership and survival, right? You have to have your court management infrastructure team in place. You need to know how to communicate, and you have to have money. So it wasn't surprising that those three hit the surface. So what I provided you in your materials, and I'm not going to go through them so that Anne can go into hers, but look in your materials. What I've given you is the profile that emerged from the research findings about the desirable characteristics and credentials moving forward to the clerk administrator position. And what's listed here is those items in the leadership area and in the knowledge and skill area are those that were identified at a 4.5 level or above when it was broken down by the classifications. I did the same thing for chief deputy. So if you are an employer or in some way responsible for the development of people in these positions, or you yourself want to develop your own characteristics in keeping with what the current leaders think you all need going forward, I provided you with a small profile for you to consider. Anne, I will now be the microphone lady, and
we'll do a swap.
We'll swap.
Okay. Let me get the technology little button happening here. And my notes, because you know I'm a professor and I'm a lawyer and I can't talk without my notes. Some of you are probably wondering what on earth an Australian law professor is doing here talking about court administrators of a profession, so I probably should just explain a little bit about my background before I talk about this and how I got involved in this. I used to work for something called the Australian Institute of Judicial Administration. You think National Centre for State Courts and divide by 10, and that's about the size of it. More recently I've done some work with IACA, the International Association for Court Administration, and some conversations I had with Jeff Apperson, who was the inaugural IACA president, and Richard Foster, the Australian court administrator, who's the current president. They were interested in getting a profile of who court administrators are, you know, where you guys come from, what's your background, what's your education, your training needs. So we started off with the idea of doing a bit of a survey as a first stage in this research to try and build up a bit of a profile of the profession. So this is the survey that we did. Basically, this survey was circulated through the Australian Court Administrators Group, so we've got about 27 Australian respondents, a small profession in Australia. Through NACAM, 220, and also through Norman Myers' offices through the Federal Clerks Group. So the group of both state and federal senior court executives in the States, and a couple of ring-ins from Canada and Mexico. So those were our survey respondents. The survey was circulated through the web through about December 2010 to February 2011, and then December 2011 to January 2012 to the US group. So there are a few differences in some of the findings between Australia and the US as we go along. I'll mention those, but I've aggregated the results for this presentation. So a bit about who our respondents were. Basically, survey respondents predominantly from the 40-plus age bracket. In fact, over 65% were in the 50-plus. So we're talking the baby boomers that Maureen was talking about. The gender difference there is not actually statistically significant, but what was interesting for me was that in the Australian situation it was quite a higher percentage. The percentage of males was somewhere around the 70-75% in Australia, slightly different profile to the US, and that was, I guess, interesting for me. So we asked about current role and position to get a feel for, you know, who our survey respondents were. So you can see the categories there. I hope you can read that. Court administrator or administrator positions, just over 30%. Clerk of court, 19%. Deputies, 8%. Managers, 8%. Circuit administrators and executives, and those who describe their position as a CEO or executive director, slightly smaller percentages. Managers of court operations, managers and supervisors. Basically, the majority were for senior leadership to middle management positions. So perhaps a similar cohort to Maureen's survey, but slightly, obviously, smaller numbers. Length of service, an average of about 14 3/4 years. Median in statistical terms around 12. In fact, most people who responded to this survey had served in their current role for about 10 years. So we're looking at an older cohort who've been in their position for a long period of time, an experienced group. We also asked about prior work experience, and we began with a question that this was designed to test a theory that we had, that most people who got to these positions in courts had actually come up through the ranks, that they'd come from other areas, other management roles within the court. And not surprisingly, we found, and perhaps what is surprising about that statistic was that we found that nearly 20% had actually come to their current position from a role outside the court. I think if we'd done this survey maybe 10, 15 years ago, we wouldn't have found that. And we know that in other professional groups, we've seen that sort of increasing professionalisation of management over the last 20 years. So professional managers who move between different organisations. We've had a couple of high-profile appointments to court management in my country recently of people who have come from completely different industries to courts, and some of those have been kind of controversial. I don't think we would have seen that sort of appointment maybe 10, 15 years ago. So we asked people about, what was their previous role in courts. The majority, their previous court experience was other administrative or management roles, not surprisingly, but a significant percentage had experience in other legal roles, so maybe a judicial role or an attorney role, an advising role within the court, or within another justice agency, so still broadly within the sector. A smaller number had prior experience outside court, and those were in areas like IT, HR, and general management. And those, again, perhaps not surprising as areas that have been, a focus really of some of the developments that have happened in courts over the last 10 or 15 years. We also asked what other industries or areas have you been employed in? We're just asking people to look back over their work history. I guess, consistently with their answers to previous questions, it's not surprising that most popular response to that was government, either the judicial or other branch of government. But quite a large percentage had also worked in private companies. The legal sector, education and customer service were also relatively popular choices. And obviously, people nominated often more than one area, which is why those percentages don't just stack up to 100%. People had a variety of different work experience. Okay, moving on to educational qualifications, which was our next area of question. We asked what your most recent educational qualification was. So master's degrees, you can see from the graph, was the most commonly held recent qualification, followed by a bachelor's or a JD degree. Programs and certifications from organisations like NCSC, ICM programs were also popular, and you can also see other university college type qualifications. And again, I think see that perhaps consistency with some of the findings from Maureen's survey about the value of those masters, those people perceiving the value of those qualifications, the masters and bachelor's degrees. But it was interesting, we asked also, well, what's assisted you most to undertake your role? So we asked people to nominate from these categories the sort of things that had assisted them. Educational qualifications were clearly valued, but I think it really tells you something about our profession and our organisations that most people nominated on-the-job training as the thing that had assisted them most, the single most valuable source of assistance in performing their role. And a similar number, similar number, in fact, nominated mentoring and supervision to educational qualifications as a source of assistance. Conference and seminars also identified as useful, but to a lesser degree. And what was interesting about conferences and seminars, when you take those together with some of the subsequent answers, it's clear that one of the things you as a group really value is those opportunities for peer networking and learning from each other. And that's, consistent, I think, too, with the value placed on the job training, mentoring and supervision. Okay. We asked specifically about, so what training have you received relevant to your role in court management? You can see the range of responses there. Respondents had typically received training from multiple sources, and popular sources included training programs, obviously NCSC, Federal Judicial Centre, also state administrative office programs, various types of conferences and seminars, but also external university, the Michigan State programs, and a smaller number of people nominated online programs. But what was typical about this profile and these responses were that people generally indicated a reliance on multiple sources of training and input. We also asked about future training needs, and I guess this is where there might possibly be a bit of overlap or correlation between our survey findings. But I think it's important to note that we were asking our respondents about their future training needs. I think Maureen's survey was really asking people to put themselves in a position and give an opinion about what they saw the leaders of the future in courts as requiring. But there's some overlap depending, I think, on where our people saw themselves in that process. So if you were somebody perhaps coming towards the end of your career, you might answer this question with an eye to what the generation coming up behind you might require. Or you might say, well, I don't really have any future training needs. I'm coming to the end of my time. I'm done. So you can see there leadership. And again, I think that hits some buttons with the findings of Maureen's survey. There's the single most important area of training that was nominated, leadership. And even some of the areas, smaller areas that I was looking at this again last night and thinking, we've classified separately things like dealing with organisational change, measuring, reporting performance, some of those things too. I think, if you drill down, and I'd love to do some more focus group stuff with people about this, I think might even fall within that general level of management skill, of leadership skills. It was really clear this was an area that people were really focused on. Other areas, and perhaps not surprisingly, in current financial climes, budgetary, financial, accounting, skills, HR management and general management administration, IT. So they varied from the specific to some of the quite general. The other category was interesting. In fact, about 5% of respondents said they weren't looking for any further training, and a number said, this is where I'm getting towards retirement. I'm done. I've had all I need. About 2% weren't really sure, and then there were a variety of other responses of people who said they were pretty supportive of training but really didn't have any general ideas about what it was they needed. Responses also asked about preferred methods of training. And again, you can see a strong preference for specific design programs that are really designed specifically through centres such as the National Centre, professional associations, sharing ideas and networking, conferences and seminars. Value placed also on professional, on university qualifications, the master's programs, the JD, certificates, mentoring and short courses. I was kind of disappointed that webinars didn't get much of a rating by our respondents. And maybe that's just an Australian specific thing. We cover a lot of distances in our courts, so video link stuff is quite popular. I'd be interested to hear from you about whether that's something that is used in your courts for in-house training. I've spoken to a number of people here who I know use those sort of networks for court meetings. So I guess that's really what I can tell you about our survey in terms of the content of today's presentation. There were a number of other question areas that were asked, and because NACAM were so helpful with the survey, I've actually made available a copy of the analysis of the full results. It's up there on the NACAM website, but I'm also happy to provide it to anyone else who's interested in the profile. But, for me it's been a bit of a fascinating glimpse, I think, into a group of people that I've worked with professionally over the years in both Australia and the US. And one of the things IACA would like to do is to maybe start building up a picture more generally about court administration as a profile in some of the other countries that we deal with, particularly trying to use this to work with development programs in countries where there are rule of law initiatives. So that's it from me.
The next slide. What do we do? What's next? And I think in the next slide up, we ask you to consider the implications of what we've come to from these findings. How many of you here are either in HR positions or some place within your organizations where you develop job classifications or job descriptions? Handful of you. If you think about it from that perspective, organizationally, and those of you who are in the MSU Human Resource Management course know that we spent time talking about job descriptions and classifications and hiring and retention. If you could please, as you reflect on your job announcements and your classifications and your descriptions, can you respond to what, if anything, about your current classifications or descriptions are either aligned with these results or need to be looked at in comparison to these results? Do you have any thoughts on those? You're smiling. You have to talk into the microphone so that we can get you on the screen. That's okay.
What comes to my mind immediately when it comes to job descriptions and classifications in the courts is that they're meaningless.
They're meaningless.
They're always a moving target. They will always be manipulated. There's always pressure to reclassify as a way to a higher salary that in courts they're kind of meaningless. But that's my cynical thought that crosses my mind.
Now, are they always because the jobs are changing or because we have a hard time getting them right? Why am I talking into this? I'm microphone challenged today. Is it because we don't get them right? Because it's a moving target.
In other words, there is no right. You will never get them right.
You'll never get them right. What? Anybody else think about that? Over here.
I think as court technology,
Is that on? Or okay.
I think as court technology evolves the way we do our business in the courts, I think the position descriptions will have to evolve as well. So it will be a moving target. I think his look on it was the budgetary needs and moving the classification to where it meets the pay scale and the competitive pay scale from private to public sector. But I think also a big piece of it will be as the court's jobs evolve, so too the position and job descriptions.
Okay. Anything else about that? Over here. Hey, Rick, how are you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that kind of surprised me, and I was fortunate to be part of Maureen's survey, was case management. And I noticed that with the Australian survey too, that case management appeared to be valued, or maybe valued is too strong of the word, but prioritized less so than things like budgeting and HR management. And I know in the past, court administration has kind of evolved over time, and originally the purpose, I've heard Ernie Friesen talk about this in past NACOM conference, that case management needs to be and should continue to be a priority for us as case managers. And so in some respects I was a little taken back that case management had maybe been lowered somewhat in terms of the needs and the skills and the abilities that we should have, that our primary role should be really to support the court in their ability to effectively manage the cases that come before us.
Yeah, that finding was surprising to me as well. I want to ask you about this issue. Some of our partners that participate in the judicial administration program are from muni courts or local courts. They're embedded in local government. And what they have oftentimes reported is that the job classifications are generic for the entire governmental unit and are not, we've talked about this, they're not reflective of the work of the court, the kind of knowledge and skill that's required, the kind of experience. And basically, for lack of better terminology, kind of junk in, junk out. What could associations that represent those courts or individual administrators do with the findings that we've covered today related to moving forward descriptions that are more akin to the work that you do?
And for Texas municipal courts, this is an ongoing challenge for us at the local government level, that they hire warm bodies because management does not understand the work of the court. And so they hire people with minimum skills, minimum knowledge, and then they wonder why the courts are in a mess. So my proposed suggestion would be that we take your findings and give them to the HR associations within Texas, and see if we can start working towards changing our job descriptions within our local government areas.
I think that's an excellent idea, because it really is about education, education, education. Of course, you'll have to document. You have NACOM's core competencies. You have this research that you can use. You can. You probably have other local kind of information. And the more that you can build critical mass toward that effort, the better. That's why I said, of course, individually, you ought to go to your individual government units. But as an association, many of the folks in my program belong to associations, and they're saying, what can we do? And I think that you cannot wait for them to realize the knowledge and skill that's required for these jobs. That you now have, between the competencies and this research and the fact that university programs are being developed to represent this, and in my work with how emerging occupations gain professional status, one of the key identifiers that you have made it, quote unquote, is that there are designated degrees specifically related to that profession. And now you have them. Now you have them. That's another indicator. I would use that information. Anybody else have any thoughts about that? Okay, so then think about organizationally, if you are looking to be mentored, or you are in a position to mentor, how could you use the data that Ann and I discovered in our research to fashion a mentoring program and or relationship? you do that? Don't do that, Maureen. How could you use this? Have any of you ever been mentored? Yeah? Can you think about how you would use this? TJ?
I think it's more of an issue that we've got to look at our state associations. Like the lady from Texas was talking about sharing it with HR associations. We're thinking about that in Georgia as well. That individually this information is helpful for us in our careers, but until we get that out there at a statewide level, and more importantly to counties and whoever is doing the classifications, then that information tends to help us lift up the profession by having the right, whether it's credentials, education, experience, so that there is better mobility. I think you mentioned the key thing of a chief deputy in a small court moving up and becoming a chief deputy in a large court rather than jumping up and being the top dog.
Right.
If we have that ability to have the mobility where we generally understand that having these types of credentials, experience, education, etc., will prepare us for a certain level of position, then there's going to be greater mobility and keeping actually people within your state or even within your court system if we know that all those things are interchangeable amongst the different positions in the state.
Right. The whole developing a career path, when I started working in the courts, now I can tell you the dinosaurs had stopped roaming the planet at that time, but it was a long time ago. There was no notion about transferability of skills. None. When I told my family I'm working in the court, they looked at me like, did you become a judge and we didn't know that? But, and it is still a hidden branch of government, unless you're watching Judge Judy, though my favorite was always Night Court. Unless you are watching some television program or some of the recent cases in the news, it's a hidden branch of government. And our positions, like, who are you and why do we need you? Which is another reason during budget cutting times, you want to make sure your value is known and understood. And the other thing that we are terribly bad about and at in the courts is that we really don't do any kind of succession planning. And that doesn't happen for a whole lot of reasons. Because some people say, I don't even want to go down that pathway. But you can mentor, you can coach, you can help people in that process develop their thinking skills to move forward. Individually, any of you here in the room looking to make this a career, long-term career goal, and do you feel like you can use any of this information? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm a researcher and I'm just kind of curious to know. I see heads shaking. Can you give me some examples of how you might use it?
As a manager, this is really bringing to light that I'm not focusing with my staff on where they want to go in the future. And I really need to bring that conversation to light because I have young people in the system, and really I think this material is important for them to see, for them to make decisions about where do I want to go and what do I need to do if I want to get there. So that's the importance to myself. Also, I've seen some of the skills on there where I'm like, I'm lacking in that area. That's something that I've really got to pick up on.
That you could pick up on. Okay, thank you. That makes me feel better. Because that is, I mean, in fact, the reason that we did this is to help inform, to provide information. So if you think that you're just an island out there with not any kind of support or any additional information that you could use, that there are many of us who are in the same condition or thinking the same things, and so knowledge is power, and you want to be able to use that. Anne, did I interrupt you?
What I first thought when I saw this, I know one of the problems that courts in Australia have right now is retaining younger staff who just don't see a career path in courts. And I thought one of the things I would do with this information, in fact, is take it back to our professional association, because I think that would really enable you to lay out a track for people to say, look, this is where you can go with these, and this is what you need to do to get there. And we're losing good people because they get better salaries than other places.
I also think that when you mentioned salary, it made me think about the fact that I think that there is, and will be over time, a direct correlation between how we view the professional demands of this work and the salaries that are attributed to it. That will come slowly, as we can all attest to. It will likely come over time, but the more aggressive you are, the more quickly that change will happen. And think about the fact that many of you here in the room are looking at many more years in this profession. I hope you're looking at many more years in this profession. And so it will be incumbent upon you to try to move this forward and think strategically about how to do that. Think strategically about how to do that. How do we marshal all of our association resources and our resources within our individual courts to be able to do this? Because this will become your pathway to a long career. To a long career. And last, the areas that we looked at in terms of internal communication, outreach, court infrastructure, education, training, development, research, analysis, writing, special courts, and case flow management. These were particular areas that we associate, of course, with the courts. In terms of what we're doing, are we spending any of our energies in developing those areas? Rick, you talked about the fact that you were a little bit surprised that case flow management was lower. But I oftentimes think that we don't do much related to more systematically addressing the communication issues and about building our management teams. And I see a woeful lack of knowledge in the research, analysis, and writing. Our courts are becoming increasingly more complex. And if you want to build your case with funders and others, HR people, you've got to provide them with data. And then we have all of this discussion about and movement forward on specialized courts and court services. I came out of the rehab era. So this whole thing that we've got new courts, I'm like, ha 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 ha. We are organizing them differently. We're trying to approach it differently. But we've been doing this for a very long time. But again, if you think forward into the future, think about how you could use the development of your leadership skills and capabilities along with your education, along with looking for your mix of experience to impact the courts and how they operate. Any other thoughts, questions? Because I think, in fact, we're supposed to be out of here, aren't we? Yeah? I knew somebody was watching that clock. Thank you very much. All of this will be, it's all going to be published. We're going to do a monograph on it that contains all of the information. There are many more subsets yet to go over. I'll be placing articles in NACM and other organizations, so stay tuned. So stay tuned for my research. I think Anne's going to do the same.